All right, so hi, my name's Glenn. This is the slide where I spend about 5 minutes telling you who I am, about me, things like that. But honestly, it doesn't matter. Who I am is not important here. Instead, what really matters, at least to me, and hopefully to all of you by the end of this talk, is something I'm calling the morality of code. And before I go any further, I want to be very clear here that I'm not trying to lecture anybody or about their moral opinions or what my moral opinions be. Instead, I'm here to talk about the idea that we as software engineers, we need to take the time to consider our moral opinions, whatever they may be, both before and after we write our code. My goal isn't to tell you what to do, but to help you find a way to make your own moral decisions regarding your code. Okay, so with that put aside, what do I mean when I say morality of code? So that is to say, what morality does a block of code have? Of course, many of you might say that code can't have any morality, it's just bits, it's incapable of morality. And I'm going to agree with you there. It's just bits. Bits are not the problem. It's what you do with the bits. Morality of code isn't about whether or not those bits in and of themselves are moral. Instead, it's about how those bits are used. It's about what our intent is in aligning those bits into certain patterns. It's about understanding what happens when other people consume our code and how our own personal morality shapes the code itself. So here's the starting definition I suggest that we use. Morality of code is about understanding the moral consequences of what happens when someone executes or reads our code. So there's a paper out in the cryptographic community. It's called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work. And I think it applies equally as well here to the greater computer science community. The author, Dr. Rogway, he writes, I suspect that many of you see no real connection between social, political, and ethical values and what you work on. And I think he's right. Most of us never really think about this stuff at all. We never consider the moral consequences of the code we are writing. We never ask ourselves, can this code be used to cause pain or spread hate, induce fear, or oppress others? We never ask ourselves these questions because considering the moral consequences of things is hard. I think it takes courage and I think it takes work. In fact, instead of confronting these topics, we come up with convenient little shortcuts, little white lies, if you will, that we tell ourselves and others to avoid facing this subject. These are things like, I'm just writing code here, I'm not responsible for what people do with it, or nobody would ever use my code like that. Or if I didn't write it, someone else would. These little platitudes, they let us sidestep the moral considerations of what we do. And the little white lie we tell ourselves most commonly is this one here. My stuff isn't harming anyone. Listen, we all want to believe that our code is just code. We put it out there into the universe and it's only used to make, sunshine and rainbows. Except the reality is our code is out there for anyone to do whatever they want. To steal, to harass, to bully, to oppress. Tell me a group that you are morally opposed to, and I bet I can show you an example of them using common tools. I went to literally the website of literally the first hate group I could think of. And I'm intentionally not naming names here. But I went and I found that they're using WordPress, they're using jQuery, they're using Google Analytics. They're using all the same coding tools that we use, the same languages, the same package managers, the same libraries. But something deep inside of us wants to brush this off and ignore it and pretend like it doesn't exist. This is all good and well until you realize that something you wrote is killing people. I'm sure that sounds a little overly dramatic to some of you. You may think I'm even playing this up a bit. But realize that, again, that this is just your brain trying to avoid thinking about this subject. This is hard stuff. And ultimately, nobody wants to believe that we are participants in other people's suffering. Our famous or infamous JavaScript community satirist, Jen Schiffer, if you don't know who she is, look her up. Her talks are great. She recently talked about this in a blog post that she wrote. And so she wrote, I think it's safe to say that every tool we create has the potential to be used as a vehicle for harassment. Once you share your code for others to use, whether you do it commercially or open source, there is no limit to what other people can do with it. And by not weighing the moral consequences of our work, we are allowing, permitting, encouraging even our code to be used in ways that we as individuals and as a community may find reprehensible. We cannot rely on the users of our code to be doing the right thing, however we choose to define that. So therefore, we must take steps to try and ensure that they aren't doing the wrong thing. So how do we do that? How do we ensure that our code is used in a morally responsible way? Well, let's start by looking at what we mean by morally responsible first. So to me, morally responsible means in alignment with my moral and ethical opinions. You obviously are different and have your own moral and ethical opinions that are different than mine. We each have our own morality. To be morally responsible means to act in a manner consistent with our opinions. What we want is for the users of our code to behave in a moral and ethical manner that is consistent with ours. This is the expectation we have when we release our code into the wild, that our code is being used in a morally consistent manner to our own and not contrary to it. To use our code otherwise would be used in a morally irresponsible fashion. So what we mean by morally responsible is morally consistent manner to our own. Now, with that in mind, we can begin to examine our code to understand the moral opinions within it. So I propose you do this by asking yourself 4 questions, and I'm going to run through them here. Question 1, what are my moral intents as the author of the code? That is to say, what morality do I bring to the code itself? If I write a program, for example, for engaging a distributed denial of service attack, my reasons for writing it have moral implications. Am I writing it to test my servers, or am I writing it to get back at someone? This is my moral intent, my moral purpose in writing the code. Second, what are my users going to do with this code? In order to understand the moral implications of your code, you first need to understand what can be done with your code. So here I say challenge yourself to imagine all of the possible scenarios, all of the ways your code can be used for both good and for evil. This is kind of a thought experiment, and it may be a little hard, it may take a while, or it may be really easy. I think this largely depends on the scope of what you're writing and the audacity of the idea that you are trying to implement. But once you understand what can be done with your code, you can ask yourself the third question. What are my obligations to those who suffer the effects of my code? See, the users of your code are not who you need to worry about. If I write a Twitter bot library that just replies to tweets, for example, it is the user of the library who decides how to direct the Twitter bot. The user of the library is not the target of the library. The target is whomever the Twitter bot is aimed at. The recipients of your code are those who suffer the consequences of it. So how do you feel about the people being targeted by your code? Can you empathize with them? Are they being wronged? Once you know how you feel about these people, you can ask yourself the final question. What are my responsibilities for what people do with this code, both morally and legally? Do I have a moral obligation to protect them from using my code to hurt or to harm or to shame or to harass? Do I have a legal obligation? How do I protect myself? And much more importantly, how do I protect others? I believe that by examining your code through the lens of these 4 questions, that it helps me, that it will help us understand that understand the moral impact our code can have on other people. And once you understand that, I think you can think about how to manage it. So here are some thoughts I have on how to manage this, how to manage how others use your code. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some options that I'm going to throw out and you can consider. So for example, consider not writing it in the first place. Now, I'm not advocating we all stop writing code, but maybe for some things, maybe it's better if it was never written at all. All I'm asking is that before you write it, think about whether or not it should be written. In the past year, futurist Sam Harris, he gave a TED Talk entitled, "Can We Build AI Without Losing Control Over It?" In it, he argues not that we don't try to build AI, but that we first must develop the ethical and moral understanding necessary to do it safely. Maybe that's the responsible thing to do here. Don't give up, but first understand the moral impact of what we are doing and ask yourself, is this right or is this wrong? Now, if you absolutely must write something, consider not releasing everything. Again, don't get me wrong. I love the open source movement. I participated in it just like everybody else in this room. But maybe we don't need to release every little thing to GitHub. Maybe sometimes we need to keep some code for ourselves. It falls to us to be the gatekeepers that prevent bad or harmful or malicious code from being exposed to the greater world. Of course, if you do have your heart set on sharing, consider building in safeguards. Write code around your code that actively works to prevent the usage you deem inappropriate. Of course, we know that anything can be circumvented, and in JavaScript especially, code is very easy to edit and disable. But again, at least you are trying to be responsible. And your safeguards force others to actively be irresponsible. This is like locking your car doors. It's not going to prevent someone from stealing something out of your car, but it does make them have to work ever so slightly harder at it. This is also the keeping honest people honest philosophy. And I believe that it works for code as well. So regardless of whether or not you do build in safeguards, I encourage everyone to explain your intent. For every project that you have, write a mission statement. Explain why you wrote the code, explain your intended usage, and discourage the usage that you disagree with. Again, another Jen Schiffer quote from that same blog post that she wrote. She said, if you create something that is used other than your initial intentions, you are responsible to make it clear what your artist statement is or what the lesson you are trying to teach is. So this could be as simple as adding a README or a license file to your project, a usage statement, TXT if you will. And here's a small example for a project that I maintain. So a usage statement could be as simple or as detailed as you want, so long as it includes your purpose for writing the project and any usage that you would deem inappropriate. And the cost of adding such a usage statement file to your project is very low. So this is a low risk, low effort, vast upside kind of thing. Finally, before you do release anything, consider limiting usage through licensing. One of the major things that we do control in our projects is the license that gives our users certain permissions on how, when, and where they can execute our code. As you may know, a license is a grant of specific rights under specific conditions. The right to use, to copy, to distribute, to sell, to make derivative works. These are all scoped in your license file. So why not use that license to specifically deny usages that you want to prevent? Here is the MIT license. It would be very simple just to stick a condition right in here that reads something like, use of this software for criminal purposes to harass or any individual or for any reason is strictly prohibited. Or another variation that is a personal favorite of mine. Use of this software is strictly prohibited by any military or government intelligence agency or any contractor acting on behalf of a military or government intelligence agency. But there is a catch to this. Open source software means open to everyone. Prohibiting a group or class of people is against the motives of the open source movement. And by limiting your license in such a manner, you may be violating the openness of it. Also, modifying well-known licenses may not be compatible with the license itself. You will need to do some homework here. You will need to find the license that best suits your project and how it can be modified to limit against the kind of usage that you deem morally irresponsible. So, that's it. In closing, let me break the rule I mentioned in the beginning about how I am not going to impose my moral opinions on anyone. I am going to give you one moral opinion of mine. I believe that we have a moral responsibility to examine our code to ensure that it is being used in a fashion that is morally consistent with our intended design. We achieve this by examining our intent, the intent of our users, the target of our users, and our responsibilities to those targets. And it's through the answers to these questions that we understand how our code affects others and what we can do to ensure a better world. So once again, my name is Glen Goodwin. I work for SAS Institute. You can find me at these places on the internet. And I hope I've given you a little bit to think about, and that in the future, you will take the time to consider the moral consequences of the code that you write. Thank you.
Okay, we can take some questions. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask one. Go ahead.
Early in my career, I wrote some software that was a data visualization tool, which helped people in medical communities. The very first software registration card I got back, it's that old, people sending cards, was from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. There is, in fact, no way in my distribution chain that I could have actually precluded the individual from buying that app. The organization would have respected your limitations in my license agreement, but in practice, there was no way to actually enforce it from any person actually using the tool. So I had a moral quandary to decide whether I needed to call Livermore and pull it back or not. And I thought, because of all the good I do with the medical applications and other things, I felt that I could not go and put the kind of restrictions that you've just asked me to put in on the code, because it would cause too many organizations to stop looking at the code because of the license agreement, and they'd be concerned. So you raise a good point. Pragmatically, I don't think it's implementable. Do you have any advice on how to mitigate this concern? Because I think it's a real one.
So I thought about this a lot. Yes, you can't stop people. Right? There is no way to stop governments or hackers or whatever. They're going to use it if you want. But I think, especially in the case of governments, if you are incredibly specific in your license constraints, you can allow for good things to happen within the government, like you're talking about, and also keep the bad things out. You can also always approach those people and talk to them and say, well, what are you doing with that, right? And understand that maybe Lawrence Livermore is doing really interesting, useful things with it. Maybe they're doing really bad things with it. You don't know. But you can't stop it. Just do your best. And that's all I'm asking everyone to do. Just do your best.
Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but we have another speaker now, so we can't take any other questions. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.